Why is it reasonable to believe that God exists? Quite simply, because it's true that he exists. Here's my argument. Premise 1. It's reasonable to believe that which is true. Premise 2. It's true that God exists. Conclusion. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that God exists.
This clip was taken from a debate between Saitan Bruggencate and Matt Dillahunty on the topic, is it reasonable to believe in God? This sums up Sai's entire position. In order to counter his argument, we don't even need to attack his second premise. No, we can show his argument to be flawed by pointing out the error in the first premise. I would argue that it is not always reasonable to believe that which is true. Consider this thought experiment. A man of an indiscriminate race is on trial for murder. There is no evidence that he committed the crime and no way that the prosecution can link him to the crime scene. Now, there is a racist on the jury who believes that the accused is guilty, purely on racial grounds. The accused is part of race X, therefore he is guilty. All the jury members agree that there is no evidence of his guilt, but the racist jury member still believes the man did it. Is a racist juror's belief that the man is guilty reasonable? I would say no, since a justification for that belief is insufficient to qualify it as reasonable. The fact that someone is of a certain race does not mean that they are guilty of a crime. Further, upon trying their hardest to find evidence for his guilt, police officers, investigators, and lawyers were all unable to find anything. Does this prove that the racist is wrong? No, but it does show that the reason why he believes what he does is not a good one. Now, suppose a man was actually guilty. Is the racist juror's belief reasonable? Again, I would still say no, for all the same reasons as before. Unless properly justified, it would be unreasonable to believe something, even if that thing turned out to be true. So, let's get back to Sai's argument. Premise 1. It is reasonable to believe that which is true. Premise 2. It is true God exists. Conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that God exists. The argument is flawed since, even if it were true that a God exists, and that God was the one he proposed, that doesn't therefore entail that the belief in God is reasonable. Now, this argument could be changed in order to avoid this pitfall, but in doing so, it opens up another. Premise 1. It is reasonable to believe claims that have sufficient justification. Premise 2. The claim God exists has sufficient justification. Conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable to believe that God exists. Once this formulation of the argument is given, then it would be most appropriate to call into question the second premise, namely, that there is sufficient justification for the claim that God exists. This puts Sai in an uncomfortable position, as, in order to show the truth of his premise, he must give the reasons, justification, or in other words, evidence for the claim that God exists. This is something that Sai himself has refused to do.
You can't know anything to be true unless you start with God. Everyone here knows that God exists. Why don't I present evidence? Why don't I present evidence? Where do you hear evidence out in the world? In the court of law. Who do you present evidence to in court? The judge. When you come up to me and say you don't believe in God, and I present you with evidence, I'm saying that you're the judge. You're not the judge. God is the judge.
Exposing the flaws in what he just said would probably take a video in and of itself, but the point remains that Sai is not interested in giving evidence for his claim. As such, his argument fails, since if we take his formulation of it, then the first premise is false, and if we take the second formulation of it, then he would self-admittedly refuse to defend the second premise. In each case, the conclusion that it is reasonable to believe that God exists remains unsupported.